Hi, today we're going to be doing our last video in this series talking about the basics of loudspeaker placement. Now, we'll come back to it again if we get some more questions that we didn't cover. But today, really, we're going to wrap this up and talk a little bit about different sized rooms and different layouts and things that you can try when setting up your speakers. So we've already covered sort of the basic floor standing, positioning, toe in, bookshelf speakers, whether they're mounted on stands or bookshelves, center channels, all of those things. Really, we're going to talk today a little bit about what happens if I have a real huge room, a really small room, I've got a rectangular room or a square room, and what should I do in those environments. So we'll start with what is fairly typical, which is a rectangular shaped room where you'll have a long wall and a short wall. And there is some argument as to where you should ideally position your system, whether you should put them on the short wall firing down the length of the room, or you should be more in the near field and being on the long wall. That's going to give you a little bit different perspective. Placing the speakers on the short wall, on the narrow dimension of a rectangular room, is going to tend to limit the width and the overall sound stage size to a certain extent. But it can also result in more room-filling sound for a smaller seating area. I tend to prefer, if it's possible, if your room is wide enough, to try actually doing the setup on the long wall. You may be sitting a little bit closer to the speakers, but what will happen is that now the main sidewall reflections are further away from the speaker, and they will aid in the sort of size and enveloping sense of space with your loudspeaker setup. If you've got a square room, unfortunately that's pretty much worst case scenario when it comes to basic room acoustics, because any waves, standing waves, or any nodes that occur along one dimension of the room will also occur on the other dimension of the room at the same sorts of frequencies. So those rooms can be quite difficult. One of the things you can try there, if you have the option and aesthetically it works for you, is to actually mount the system with the center point between the speakers actually being one of the corners of the room. So you're essentially mounting the speakers on the walls that are coming out diagonally from that corner. That can actually give you a better level of balance, particularly at low frequencies, if you're stuck with one of these square-shaped rooms. Now, if you have a fairly small room, and I'm going to say anything that has, the main or maximum dimension is less than, let's say, 14 feet, is tending towards an acoustically small room. In those environments, obviously, you are going to be listening in the near field. There's nothing really you can do. And in some cases, you're going to be forced to have your listening position right up against the back wall. Unfortunately, that's really bad acoustically for getting a large amount of bass and mid-bass loading. So if you're forced into that situation, try pulling your couch or your listening chair out, even if it's just 6 inches or so from that rear wall, rather than having it stuck right up against it. You'll tend to get better balance in that situation. All of the other things apply in small rooms as they do in large rooms, with toe in, with how far apart the speakers are, and you can look into the previous video recommendations on those sorts of setup points. Now, one of the other things that you're going to find in a small room is that you may be limited a little bit in the soundstage size. So when it comes to things like toe in, you may want to actually toe the speakers in a little bit less than you would in a larger listening environment. In some cases, having the speakers firing straight ahead will actually give you a better sense of space in a small room. Now, we had a question from one of our message board members asking about when you might want to raise the level of speakers off the floor slightly, floor standers and subwoofers. Now, that's something that there's only 2 cases that I would attempt that with a floor standing speaker. One of them is if you've got an extremely high or an extremely low listening seat and you can't seem to get good balance because you're way off the vertical axis of the high frequency drivers of the loudspeaker. In that case, you can try raising the speaker up a little bit, or ideally, if you can, modify the sort of listening position moving further away from the speaker. What will happen if you actually raise a floor standing speaker up off the floor is you'll change what's called the floor bounce, which has a huge impact on the mid-bass response of the speaker. So when we're designing the speaker and doing the listen test, we assume that the floor boundary is where it is, right below the bottom of the cabinet. As soon as you do that, you're going to modify that floor bounce and get somewhat unpredictable results. I'm not saying that you shouldn't try it, and in some setups it's going to work well, but it's not something that I'd recommend for a typical setup. Subwoofer, same thing applies. The lower that woofer can be and closer to the floor that's in your subwoofer, the better coupling to the room you're going to get. So overall, I wouldn't recommend changing the height of those locations. And typically with subwoofers, most of the frequencies that are being reproduced are omnidirectional anyway, so having it fire closer to ear level isn't really going to help anything. It's just modifying the interaction of the subwoofer with the room. So that ends our series on loudspeaker setup. And again, if anybody has any questions I haven't covered in this series of videos, just go on the axiomaudio.com message board, sign up if you're not already a member, and ask your question there. There's an ongoing thread in our What's New section. So thank you very much.